1886. The Arizona Territory was a place carved by wind and held together by sheer stubbornness. The town of Ashwater Crossing was less a settlement and more a raw nerve exposed to the elements. Morning did not arrive gently here. It attacked. The sun rose over the high mesas and instantly began to bake the red dust that coated every living thing. It was a fine, invasive powder that worked its way into the seams of boots, the folds of linen, and the back of the throat. The wind was the town's most constant resident. It never whispered. It howled, a high, lonely shriek that tore at the canvas roofs of lean-tos and rattled the glass of the one-story bank. It screamed around the unpainted posts of the saloon porch, carrying the bitter smell of alkali and the distant, thin scent of juniper. There were only two sounds that mattered in Ashwater Crossing. The first was the slow, reluctant tolling of the church bell, a heavy, iron clang that seemed to fight the expanse of the sky. The second, the town's true heartbeat, was the blacksmith's anvil. It was a sharp, punctuating rhythm against the howl of the desert. Thump, clang, a sound of something being forcibly shaped. Rhea Calder moved against that wind, her head down, one hand holding her hat while the other gripped the handle of her physician's box. The wooden case was heavy, scarred by travel, its brass corners dulled. She wore a practical dress of faded calico, the hem darkened with dust. The wind whipped strands of near-black hair from the tight bun at the nape of her neck, stinging her cheeks. Her eyes, when she lifted them, were the color of ash gray, startlingly light in a face browned by the sun. They were observational eyes, missing nothing. From the fresh wheel ruts in the road to the way the buzzards were already gathering in the high, hot blue. She was headed to the Sunglint Ranch, a stretch of land that sat just beyond the town's meager shadow. The ranch was cleaner than the town proper, the fences mended with new wire, the water trough full and free of scum. Cassian Pike stood in the deep shadow of the barn, watching her 10-minute walk from the edge of town become its final 100 yards. He was a tall man, built with the kind of broad, dense shoulders that came from a life of lifting things that did not want to be lifted: rock, timber, stubborn mules. The sun, when it caught him, illuminated the thin, silvered line of a scar that cut a path from his jawline almost to his ear. He didn't move as she approached, his stillness that of a predator, or a man expecting trouble. Rhea's steps were steady. She was used to being watched. But the sounds of the town seemed to follow her, crawling up the road behind her. The whispers were as constant as the grit between her teeth. She had heard them in the mercantile, felt them at her back when she visited the post office. That's her, the widow of that burnt prospector. Came in on the last stage with nothing but that box and a story about a mine collapse. And the one that always came with a wet, cheap chuckle from the men loafing outside the saloon? Here's tell she cries better than she cures. The laughter was a physical thing, sharp and derisive, cutting at her in the open air. Cassian Pike offered no greeting. He just nodded once, a gesture of acknowledgement, not welcome, and jerked his chin toward the corral. The mare. The horse was a fine bay, slick with sweat in the already oppressive heat. Her eyes were wide, the whites showing in panic, and she tossed her head, fighting a pain Rhea could see from 20 feet away. The animal's muzzle was raw, a bloody pulp of torn skin and inflamed flesh. Found her by the north line. Cassian said. His voice was low and rough, like stones dragging in a dry wash. Noseband was cinched to the bone, wire looked deliberate. Rhea set her box down on a clean bale of hay. She didn't coo at the horse or offer it meaningless comforts. She moved slowly, her hands open, letting the mare smell the carbolic soap and the faint scent of herbs that clung to her. "Easy, girl," she murmured, her voice calm and low, speaking not to the horse, but to the tension that vibrated in the air around it. She worked with a clean, practiced economy of motion. The horse, which had been flinching and pulling away from Cassian, gradually stilled under her touch. Rhea's fingers were deft, cleaning the horrific wound with boiled water and a soft cloth. Her touch gentle but inescapably firm. The mare shuddered but held. Rhea then applied a thick, dark salve of her own making, her motions sure. She worked without hesitation, her concentration absolute. Cassian watched her. He watched her hands, how they never fumbled. He had seen men who called themselves doctors, men with framed diplomas, break into a sweat at the sight of less blood. He watched the ash-gray eyes, focused, competent, and completely dry. When she was finished, Rhea packed her tools, wiping each one clean before latching the box. She'll need clean water and soft feed, nothing near her mouth for a few days. That skin will pull tight and scar badly if it isn't kept clean. Cassian nodded. He disappeared into the darkness of the feed shed. He returned carrying a heavy sack of barley, nearly a full bushel. He dropped it at her feet with a solid thump. It was more than fair payment. It was double. Rhea looked at the sack, then at his face. His expression was unreadable. "My well's open," Cassian Pike said, his gaze shifting past her, toward the dusty sprawl of Ashwater Crossing. "Anytime you're thirsty." It was not an invitation to socialize. It was a statement of fact. In a land where water was currency, wealth, and life itself, it was the closest thing to an alliance. Rhea nodded once, bent, and hefted the heavy sack to her shoulder. She refused to show the strain of the weight, just as she refused to acknowledge the whispers. She turned and began the long walk back. Later that day, the heat congealed. By 3 o'clock, the sun was a white-hot spike driving the temperature up past 100 degrees. The Long Shadow Saloon was the only place collecting men, its dark interior promising a false cool. The air inside was a thick soup of stale beer, body odor, and the oily smoke of cheap tobacco. Rhea Calder was not inside. She was next door, at the Mercantile, trying to trade a portion of her barley for laudanum and fresh bandages. The store was empty, the proprietor asleep in a chair behind the counter. Through the open doorway connecting the two buildings, she heard the laughter. It was loud, barking, and deliberately performative. "Saw the cry doctor out at Pike's place?" one man yelled. He was new, one of Horace Delaney's men, identifiable by his unworn boots and the silver dollar he was spinning on the bar. Horace Delaney was the railroad, and the railroad was the future. Delaney had no patience for the past, which, in his eyes, included stubborn ranchers like Cassian Pike who refused to sell their water rights. "I reckon she cried him a river to water that stock," another joined in, and the group roared. Rhea paused, her hand on a bolt of muslin. She needed the supplies. She tried to ignore them, to force her mind back to the task. A third man, burly and smelling of whiskey even from 6 feet away, stepped out of the saloon's shadow and into the Mercantile, blocking her path to the counter. "What's the matter? Widow run out of tears for the day?" Rhea stopped. The street noise outside seemed to fade. The anvil was silent. The ever-present wind seemed to hold its breath. She looked up at the man. Her gray eyes were flat, cold, and devoid of the moisture they mocked. She swallowed. A small, tight, painful motion in her throat. "I'd rather die," she said, her voice quiet but carrying in the dry, hot air, "than cry in front of you." Across the street, tying his own horse to the rail outside the land office, Cassian Pike saw it all. He had come to town to file a complaint about his cut fence. He saw the way the men, Delaney's crew, he noted with a grim tightening of his jaw, swaggered out to surround her on the boardwalk. He saw the slight, almost imperceptible tremor in her hands as she clutched her medical satchel. He saw the large man laugh, a loud, ugly sound, as if her defiance were the punchline to a dirty joke. And he saw the single, furious tear that welled in the corner of her right eye. He watched as she refused to let it fall, her chin lifting, her throat working as she swallowed it back. Cassian Pike frowned, a deep, angry line forming between his brows. He watched the men swagger back into the Long Shadow, their laughter bouncing off the false front buildings, leaving her standing alone in the brutal sunlight. He knew exactly what this was. The rumors had been blowing through town for weeks, stinging like sand. Horace Delaney wanted the Sunglint Ranch. His surveyors claimed the railroad needed the high ground for a coaling station and a water tower. Pike's Land had the only reliable, deep-dug well in the county, the same well he had offered to Rhea. Sheriff Boaz Kincaid, a man who polished his badge until it shone, but never seemed to see any actual crime, had suddenly found Delaney's payroll very agreeable. Cassian had been warned his neighbors were being paid to find fault with his fences. This public mockery of Rhea wasn't random. It was a message, as clear as the wire on his mare's muzzle. Pike was associating with the town's refuse. He was isolated. They were testing his fences, in more ways than one. That evening, the sun finally bled out behind the salt hills, leaving the sky a bruised, spectacular purple and copper. Rhea sat in her small rented room behind the bakery. It was hot, and the air smelled of day-old yeast and simmering lard. She was cleaning her instruments by the light of a single kerosene lamp, her movements precise. The town was quiet, but the desert was never silent. The cicadas began their nightly drone. Then she heard it, a sound that did not belong to the desert. A low, rough whistling. It wasn't a tune. It was a signal, a sharp, three-note call, like a quail, but harder, meaner. It came from the direction of the salt hills, north of the town, in the direction of the Sunglint. Rhea froze. She moved to the window, pushing aside the thin, flour sack curtain. Far out, past the last flickering lights of the town, beyond the dark, solid shape of Cassian Pike's ranch. She saw it, a plume of smoke, different from a cooking fire or a chimney. It was dark, greasy, and rising too fast against the twilight. A premonition, cold and immediate, settled in her chest. It was a horribly familiar feeling, the same suffocating dread she had felt the night the timbers cracked and the mine entrance collapsed, taking her husband and her old life with it. It was the feeling of disaster, of malice, of things set in motion by cruel hands. It spread through her like cold ash. High above the territory, a red-tailed hawk made one final, soaring circle, its shadow sweeping over the copper-colored earth. Its piercing eyes saw the small, lit window of the healer and the dark, quiet ranch house of the horseman. Below, two fates, unaware of the other's orbit, were being pulled into the same inevitable, tightening spiral. The smoke Rhea had seen was from Cassian's hay shed. He had spent the better part of 2 days beating back the flames, which had been set to his winter feed. He'd lost half of it. He didn't report it to Sheriff Kincaid. There was no point. It was a message, and he had received it. A few mornings later, Rhea was in the mercantile, standing near the back by the patent medicines. When May Pike came in, Cassian's mother was a small woman, made smaller by the years, but her back was straight. She was buying flour and salt, and she was trying to hide a cough. It was a dry, rasping sound, a deep rattle in her chest that she tried to smother in a handkerchief. It was the kind of cough that settled in for the winter and didn't leave until spring, if it left at all. Rhea watched, her gray eyes missing nothing. She recognized the sound of lungs fighting against dust and age. That evening, Rhea walked to the Sunglint. The sun was a low, bleeding smear on the horizon. She didn't go to the front door of the main house. She went to the small, covered porch off the kitchen, where a man might leave a side of venison or a sack of mail, on a clean-scrubbed wooden bench. She placed a small muslin bag tied with twine. Inside was a mix of dried mullein leaf and horehound, herbs she had spent her few free hours gathering and drying. Tucked into the twine was a small, torn piece of paper, the same kind she used for patient notes. In her neat, practical script, she had written 2 words, "Simmer low." She did not knock. She did not wait. She turned and walked back to town, melting into the deep purple shadows. When Cassian came in from the line, he found the bag. He untied it, the scent of the dried herbs rising to meet him bitter, clean, and medicinal. He looked at the note. He had been listening to his mother's cough for a week, a sound that always put a knot of fear in his gut. He looked out into the darkness. There was nothing, just the sound of the wind. He took the bag inside to the stove. The next morning, Rhea found a gallon jar of dark, rich mesquite honey on the step outside her small room. There was no note. None was needed. It was May Pike's payment, delivered by her son. Rhea tasted it. It was sweet, smoky, and wild. It was a luxury, and it meant the debt was now hers again. Before dawn the following day, she returned to the Sunglint. She knew Cassian and May would be in the house, occupied with breakfast and the slow-boiling herbs. She let herself into the barn. The bay mare she had treated watched her, its muzzle healing to a clean, puckered scar. Rhea picked up the heavy stable broom. She started in the back and worked her way forward. She was methodical, her movements economical and strong. She swept the aisles of packed earth, clearing them of spilled feed, manure, and dust. She cleared the stalls, laying fresh straw. She cleaned and hung the tack, wiping the bits clean and coiling the reins by the horse trough. Cassian had left a large pile of split juniper and mesquite, a day's hard work with the axe. Rhea took the logs and stacked them, fitting them together in a neat, solid wall of wood that reached her shoulder. She was gone before the sun cleared the eastern mesa. When Cassian entered the barn, he stopped dead. The air was different. The chaos of a working ranch had been replaced by a quiet, forceful order. His saddle, which he always threw over the nearest rail, was on its proper rack. The floor was immaculate. He walked to the woodpile. It was perfect. A stack built to withstand wind. A stack built by someone who knew the value of dry wood. He knew, with an immediate and unsettling certainty, who had done it. He had paid for the herbs with honey, a simple trade. She had repaid the honey with hours of hard, back-straining labor. This was not a trade. This was a statement. He ran one hand over the rough bark of the stacked wood, his fingers tracing the invisible lines of her work. Their lives began to overlap, stitched together by these silent, practical threads. Rhea started using the well, as he had offered. She came at midday, when he was checking the far pastures and his mother was napping, but she left signs, faint as a whisper. One afternoon, checking the fence line near the well, Cassian found it, a single, long, dark strand of her hair, caught on a splinter of the top rail. It was stark against the sun-bleached wood. He looked at it for a long moment, this intimate, accidental piece of her, before pulling it free. He held it in his rough palm, where it coiled like a line of dark ink, and then he opened his hand and the wind snatched it away. By the well itself, the overflow had created a patch of soft mud. His own heavy boot prints were stamped deep. Beside them, almost stepping in their shadow, was the clear, smaller print of her boot. It was a practical, worn-down heel, but narrow, unmistakable. He stood and looked at the two prints, side by side, a silent conversation in the mud. With the toe of his own boot, he scuffed them both into anonymity. A few days later, Cassian found her in town. She was leaving the smithy, her face tight with a frustration he was beginning to recognize. He stepped in front of her, blocking her path. From his jacket, he pulled a small, flat package wrapped in oiled deer hide and tied with a leather thong. He held it out. She looked at his hand, then at his face. She took the package. Her fingers were nimble as she untied the thong. Inside, resting on the soft hide, were 3 curved, gleaming steel needles. They were bone-sewing needles, fine-pointed and strong, the kind a surgeon would use, not the crude tools a frontier physician was often left with. They were expensive. They were tools of a quality she had not held in years. She looked up at him, her throat tight. The ash-gray eyes were suddenly bright, not with tears, but with a fierce, sharp understanding. "I have use for these," she said. It was all the thanks he needed. The next morning, in his feed barn, he found a tightly wound roll of clean, white linen, torn into perfect 4-inch wide strips for bandages. It was not muslin. It was high-quality linen, the kind that cost pennies an inch. Pennies she did not have. He took the roll. The ledger was balanced again. The fragile piece was broken by the sound of hoofbeats and crude laughter. A half-dozen of Delaney's men rode onto Cassian's land. They weren't hiding. They rode along the low ridge that marked his property line, carrying an armful of wooden stakes. Each one painted a garish, arrogant red. They hammered them into the dry ground, creating a new, false border, one that cut off Cassian's access to the small creek that fed his lower pasture. Cassian watched them from the porch, his rifle in his hands, but he did not raise it. He just watched, his face a mask of cold fury. When they were finished, they fired a few shots into the air and rode back to the saloon, their yells echoing in the canyon. After they were long gone, Cassian rode out. He didn't just pull the stakes. He tore them from the earth. He rode back to the ranch house, the bundle of shattered red wood in his arms, and threw them in a pile by his chopping block, a testament to the violation. Rhea saw the pile when she came for water. She saw the raw anger in the splintered wood, in the way they had been thrown down. She said nothing, just filled her buckets and left. But she returned that night, a shadow moving in the moonlight. She gathered the broken red stakes, piece by piece. She carried them back to her room, to the small, cold ash pit where she burned her waste. She buried the stakes deep in the gray, powdery ash, covering the last bit of red until they were gone. She was erasing the insult, hiding the evidence of their trespass, turning their fiery color to the color of her eyes. The sky remained a hard, metallic blue, empty of clouds. The drought held. The dust was a constant presence, a grit that got between the teeth and clouded the air. In the tension, words became a luxury. They learned to speak in the silence, reading the lines around each other's eyes, the set of a shoulder, the shrill, distant whistle of Delaney's locomotives, laying track 5 miles to the south, became a constant, nagging reminder of the force gathering against them. One evening, Rhea found Cassian on his porch, slumped in a chair, his face slick with sweat and grime. He had spent the entire day reinforcing the well walls, fighting a cave-in. He looked exhausted, beaten down by the sheer, dumb weight of the earth. She stepped onto the porch, her footsteps so light he only noticed when her shadow fell over him. She was holding a small bundle wrapped in a clean cloth. She set it on the step beside him. Inside were 2 thick squares of corned bead, still warm from the baker's oven, sweetened with maize honey. She gave him a small, weary smile. It was brief, but it lit her face. He just looked at her. He was too tired to speak, too tired to even nod. He just watched her turn and walk away. He picked up the cornbread. It was solid and real. The next night, the tables were turned. The temperature dropped 20 degrees the moment the sun vanished, the way it only can in the high desert. Rhea had been at the blacksmith's, setting a break in his son's arm. She had been there for hours. When she finally stepped out, the cold hit her like a fist. She wrapped her arms around herself, shivering in her thin dress. He was there, a dark, solid shape on his horse, waiting in the shadows of the alley. He leaned down, holding out a thick, dark bundle. It was a heavy wool shawl, worn but clean. It smelled of wood smoke, leather, and the faint, clean scent of the High Plains soap May Pike used. "Desert nights get cold," he said, his voice a low rumble. She took it. The wool was rough against her skin, but it was warmer than any fire. She wrapped it around her shoulders, pulling it tight, burying her chin in its folds. She looked up at him, a silhouette against a million stars. She didn't say thank you. He didn't say you're welcome. The words were useless. They were barter. In this place, you paid your debts. Trust wasn't a sudden bloom. It was a root, growing deep underground, seeking water. It was a tough, stubborn thing, like a sprig of green pushing its way up through the baked, fractured hardpan. A few days later, Rhea was on the small mesa above the ranch, gathering wild thyme. The wool shawl pinned at her throat. The wind was high, and it carried the sounds from the corral below. She paused, her hands full of herbs, and looked down. Cassian was in the round pen with a new Mustang, a wild, raw-boned sorrel. He wasn't breaking the horse. He was talking to it, not with words, but with his body, his weight, his stillness. It was a long, patient dance in a cloud of red dust. Man and horse, testing, retreating, and testing again. Rhea stood perfectly still, watching him. She watched the concentration in his face, the way his strength was tempered by an almost impossible patience. He was steady. He was part of this place. He had not been broken by the fire, or the whispers, or the painted red stakes. Her gaze, steady and focused, traveled the distance from the mesa to the pen. It wasn't soft, it was strong. It was the look of a woman who knew exactly what she was seeing. It settled on him, unseen, unfelt, as true and sure as a well-thrown lariat, finding its mark. The sky broke without warning. For months, the heavens over Ashwater Crossing had been a hard, white-hot lid, promising nothing but more dust. Then, one afternoon, the wind died. The anvil fell silent. The oppressive, buzzing quiet was broken by a sudden, violent crack of ozone. The smell of creosote and wet dust, a scent the territory had nearly forgotten, rose from the ground. The first drops were not drops at all. They were heavy, silver coins of water, hammering the packed earth, exploding in bursts of mud. Within 5 minutes, the sky unzipped, and a deluge, a true unseasonal gully washer, fell upon the Sunglint Ranch. Rhea had been in the small kitchen with May, listening to her cough, when the roar began. Cassian was in the barn, graining the horses. By the time Rhea ran from the house to the barn, the water was already ankle-deep in the yard, a churning red soup. She found Cassian not in the stalls, but looking up. The main barn was old, and the roof on the north side, the part he had not yet found the time or the money to replace, was failing. Water was not dripping. It was pouring, a steady, thick stream, directly onto the bales of winter hay he had saved from the fire. "The ladder!" he yelled over the thunderous roar of the rain on the tin. She did not ask questions. She saw the ladder, hauled it, and braced it as he climbed, his boots heavy with mud. He ascended into the high, dark rafters, a world of dust motes and spiderwebs. "I need the spare planks by the feed shed." Rhea ran back out into the storm. The rain was a physical blow, plastering her dark hair to her skull and cheeks in seconds. Her thin calico dress was soaked through, a cold, heavy second skin. She found the stack of lumber, selected a strong, straight plank, and wrestled it back through the mud, her muscles straining. "Up here," he called, his voice tight. She climbed the ladder, the plank balanced on her shoulder. He was perched precariously on a high crossbeam, his body angled against the slant of the roof, fighting for balance. Water streamed around him. "Pass it up," he said, one hand braced on a rafter, the other reaching down. She lifted the plank. It was heavy, slick with rain. Her fingers slipped. "I can't get the angle," she yelled, her arms trembling. "Higher, just a little higher." She climbed another rung, her own boot slipping. She stretched, her entire body taut, pushing the plank up toward his waiting hand. He leaned down, his balance shifting dangerously. His fingers found the edge of the wood just as her grip began to fail. "I have it," he said. But it was awkward. He had the end, but she had the weight, to shift it, to get the plank fully onto the rafters. He had to slide his hand down the wood until it covered hers. His hand was large, rough-skinned, and radiating a heat that seemed impossible in the cold rain. It closed over her small, cold, waterlogged fist, the shock of it, the simple, solid warmth of his skin over hers, stopped her breath. The roar of the storm faded. There was only the wood, his hand, her hand, and the sudden, undeniable contact. He held it for a beat, a long, steadying second, his grip not crushing, but completely encompassing. Then, with a grunt of exertion, he pulled the plank up and into the shadows, breaking the connection. She stayed on the ladder, her hands stinging, her pulse hammering in her throat. She passed up 2 more planks, their hands meeting on the wood each time, but never again with that same skin-on-skin finality. When the last plank was in place, the immediate cascade of water slowed to a steady drip. Cassian climbed down, his face streaked with grime, his shirt plastered to the hard muscles of his chest and shoulders. They stood in the center of the barn, dripping, breathing hard, surrounded by the smell of wet hay, wet animals, and the clean, sharp scent of the rain. Rhea was shivering, her body shaking in the cold, her arms wrapped around herself. He looked at her. He saw the way the thin dress clung to her, the dark trails of water running from her hair down the pale column of her neck. He saw her shiver. Wordlessly, he shrugged out of his heavy canvas jacket. It was damp on the outside, but its wool lining was thick and mostly dry. He did not ask. He stepped toward her and draped it over her shoulders. The jacket was heavy, immense. It swallowed her. The scent of him, wood smoke, leather, clean sweat enveloped her. A sudden, shocking intimacy. The weight of it was a comfort, a solid, physical presence. A brilliant, jagged fork of lightning lit the entire barn, turning the shadows blue-white. It was followed, seconds later, by a low, cracking boom of thunder that rattled the new planks. The sudden, violent majesty of it, the sheer, untamed power, startled a sound from Rhea. It was a laugh, small, rusty, and full of surprise. Cassian watched her, and a slow, rare smile cracked the hard line of his jaw. Touching his eyes, they stood there, sharing the awkward, new sound of their own relief. The rain gentled, settling into a steady, gray drizzle. "We should check the house," he said, his voice softer now. They walked to the main house and stood under the deep shelter of the porch, watching the water run in red rivers across the yard. The air was cold, clean, and electric. The desert, moments before dying of thirst, was now drowning. The silence between them stretched, but it was no longer the silence of strangers. It was the silence of 2 people who had just fought a small war together and won. Rhea pulled the heavy jacket tighter, burying her chin in the rough wool collar. "I used to hate the rain," she said, her voice quiet, almost lost in the drip from the eaves. He turned his head, looking at her profile, at the moisture on her eyelashes. "I've always hated fire more," she continued, her gaze fixed on the gray sheet of rain. "The fire at the mine, where my husband died." Cassian did not move. He did not speak. He just stood beside her, a solid, unmoving presence, and listened. "He was a prospector," Rhea said, her voice flat, recounting a story she had never told. "Adam, he always thought the next strike was the one. He was reckless. When the timbers caught fire, the smoke, it was so fast." She paused, her body tensing, her knuckles white where she gripped the jacket. "It was thick, black. We were in the backdrift. He ran." Her voice broke, just for a second, but she caught it, swallowing hard. "He ran. There were 2 other men with us. He pushed past me. He actually pushed me down to get to the air shaft. He made it out. I did, too, barely. The other 2, they suffocated." She finally turned to look at him, her ash-gray eyes stripped bare, showing him the old, raw wound. He died 6 months later. In a fire he set himself in a saloon in Tucson. But he left me behind in that mine. That's the part they don't whisper about in town. Cassian held her gaze. He did not look away from her shame. He did not offer condolences for the man she had lost, because he understood that was not the loss she was mourning. He saw the woman who had been pushed down, who had been abandoned, and who had pulled herself out of the smoke and kept walking. He did not reach for her. He did not offer empty comfort. He just stayed, his shoulder inches from hers, a bulwark against the cold. He proved, by simply not turning away, that he was not that other man. The rain had almost stopped. The world was reduced to the sound of steady dripping, a rhythmic tick, like a clock. She was still shivering, a fine, deep tremor that had less to do with the cold and more to do with the confession. He lifted one hand. It was the same rough, calloused hand from the rafter, stained with mud and pine resin. He moved slowly, deliberately, giving her every chance to pull away. She watched his hand approach. She did not move. She did not even breathe. His thumb, surprisingly gentle, touched her cheek. He brushed a single, wet strand of dark hair that was stuck to her skin, tucking it behind her ear. The touch was feather-light, a whisper of contact, but it broke the last, brittle barrier between them. It was a gesture of such profound, simple tenderness that her eyes welled. She did not pull back. Her gaze searched his. He leaned in, closing the small distance between them. The kiss was slow. It was not the desperate, frantic kiss of passion. It was the solid, certain kiss of recognition. His lips were warm and dry, tasting faintly of coffee and the rain. It was firm, a promise, an oath. It was a kiss that did not take, but offered. It offered shelter. Her lips, cold and trembling, softened under his. She did not kiss him back with fire. She yielded to the kiss, a long, shuddering sigh passing from her, a lifetime of tension and fear dissolving in that one, warm, solid contact. He pulled back, but only an inch, his forehead resting against hers. His hands were on her shoulders, holding the jacket in place, holding her steady. Her own hands, which had been clenched into fists at her sides, slowly uncurled and rose to rest flat against his chest. She could feel his heartbeat beneath her palm, a slow, strong, deliberate rhythm. Thump, thump, a rhythm as steady as the anvil, as reliable as the earth. They stood like that, backed against the warm wood of the house, their breath mingling in the cold air, listening to the rain drip. Rhea let her head fall forward, her forehead resting on the solid wall of his chest. It was a gesture of absolute surrender, of trust, finally, terrifyingly, given. "I thought my heart had stopped," she whispered, her voice muffled against his shirt. "After the fire, I thought it was broken, just a dead thing in my chest." He brought one of his hands up to cover hers, pressing her palm flat against his heart. "No," he said, his voice a low rumble that vibrated through her. "It is not dead. It is just learning to beat again." They did not move. The storm had passed, leaving the air washed clean. As the sky lightened, a fine, white mist began to rise from the saturated fields, as if the desert itself was breathing a long, slow sigh of relief, promising a future, promising another dawn. The peace of the rain lasted less than a day. The hope it brought was a mirage, vanishing the moment the sun burned the mud back into cracked, hard-pan clay. They arrived on horseback, not in a cloud of dust, but with the slow, deliberate plodding of men who owned the ground they rode on. 3 of them. Cassian saw them from the corral and walked to the porch, his body settling into a stance of quiet, rooted opposition. Rhea came out of the house, drying her hands on an apron, and stood just behind his shoulder. Horace Delaney led them. He was a man built of soft living, his waistcoat straining over a prosperous belly. He wore a city hat, and his boots were polished, an insult to the territory. Beside him was a thin, pale man who looked like he had been kept indoors, away from the sun. He smiled, but it was just a stretching of dry lips over bad teeth. This was Ephraim Cutter, Delaney's lawyer. The third man rode slightly behind them. He was the opposite of Cutter. He was all dust and leather, his duster worn at the cuffs and shoulders. He didn't look at Cassian. He didn't look at Delaney. His gaze, heavy and flat, settled on Rhea. This was Macklin Shore, the gunman. "Mr. Pike," Delaney began, his voice a smooth, oiled rumble that did not belong here. A fine piece of land, a bit damp after the storm, but serviceable. "It's not for sale, Delaney," Cassian said. His voice was flat. "Everything is for sale." Delaney chuckled. "It's just a question of price. But today, we're not here to buy. We're here to collect." He nodded to the lawyer. Ephraim Cutter urged his horse forward, his smile widening. He pulled a folded paper from his saddlebag. "Mr. Cassian Pike, I serve you with this legal notice, a writ of seizure for non-payment of territorial taxes, fees and levies, properly filed and certified." He tossed the paper. It fluttered and landed in the mud at Cassian's feet. "It's stamped by Sheriff Boaz Kincaid," Cutter added, his voice oily with satisfaction. "You're a liar," Cassian said, his voice dropping. "My taxes are paid, in full, to the month." "Are they?" Cutter feigned surprise. "Let me see. Yes, I'm sure you did pay. The old assessment. But the railroad, Mr. Pike, is a costly and vital enterprise. It requires certain infrastructural assurances. The territorial government, in its wisdom, saw fit to pass a new, adjusted levy. As of this morning." Cassian stared at him. The dirty, legalistic water rose around his ankles. It was a perfect trap, as foul and inescapable as quicksand. "This is thievery," Rhea said, her voice sharp. Delaney finally looked at her, his eyes assessing her like livestock. "Ma'am, this is commerce. This is the future. I'll make you an offer. Pike, out of generosity, sign the transfer papers today, and I'll give you 10 cents on the dollar for the land. It's more than it will be worth tomorrow, when it's seized." "Get off my property," Cassian said. Delaney's smile vanished. "Macklin, see that the notice is posted." Macklin Shore dismounted. He walked past Cassian, who tensed, his hands clenching into fists. But Shore ignored him. He walked to the porch, pulled a tack from his pocket, and nailed the writ of seizure to the main post of the house, the post Cassian had built with his father. The hammer blows were loud in the sudden silence. Then, with a final, lingering look at Rhea, Shore swung back onto his horse. The three of them turned and rode away, not even bothering to look back. The town was next. The poison, having been introduced at the ranch, now flooded the streets of Ashwater Crossing. Rhea needed supplies for May, whose cough had worsened with the damp. She walked to the mercantile, her head high, the invisible weight of the seizure notice on her shoulders. The Long Shadow Saloon was overflowing. Delaney was buying. The laughter was louder, meaner. Delaney's men, emboldened by their victory, spilled out onto the boardwalk, blocking her path. It was the same group as before. "Well, look here," one of them shouted. "It's the Cry Dr. Pike's special friend." "Tell us." "Widow," another sneered, stepping close, his breath a foul wave of whiskey. "We're taking bets. How much do your tears cost?" The group roared. Rhea tried to step around him. "I'm not here for you," she said, her voice tight. "Oh, but you are," the man said. "You're the town entertainment." He shoved her, hard, in the center of her chest. It was not a playful push. It was a blow. Rhea stumbled backward, her heel catching on the uneven boardwalk. She fell, landing hard on her hands and one knee. A sharp, stinging pain lanced up her leg. The street went silent. The laughter died. This was no longer mockery. It was assault. Rhea looked down. Her dress was torn at the knee. The rough, splintered wood had broken the skin. A bright, perfect bead of red blood welled up, stark against her pale skin. She stayed there, on one knee, for a long second. She looked at the blood. She looked at the ring of leering, expectant faces. Then, slowly, she pushed herself up. She did not accept the hand one of the townsmen nervously offered. She got to her feet, her spine straightening, vertebra by vertebra. She was trembling, but not from fear. It was rage. She looked at the man who had pushed her. Then her gaze swept across the entire crowd. The men from the saloon, the silent townsfolk watching from the doorways. She calmly reached down and wiped the smear of blood from her knee, her hand coming away stained. "I would rather die," she said, her voice low and carrying, a serrated blade of sound, "than kneel before any of you." She turned, her back straight, and walked away from them, leaving them standing in a heavy, shamed silence. That night, the final violation. Cassian woke to a sound, a scraping noise near the well. He grabbed his rifle and was out the door in seconds. But there was nothing, just the moonlit yard and the whisper of the wind. At dawn, he went to the well. The smell hit him first, a bitter, chemical stink that overpowered the clean scent of the desert. He looked down into the darkness. He lowered the bucket. It came up heavy. He pulled it, hand over hand. It was not full of clear, life-giving water. It was full of a dark, crystalline slurry, black salt mixed with lye. "No," he whispered. He dropped the bucket, the rope burning his hands. Rhea and May joined him, May clutching a shawl. The older woman saw the dark, viscous liquid in the bucket and let out a single, wounded sound, a small "oh" of absolute despair. The well was poisoned, ruined, in a land where water was blood. This was a mortal wound. May Pike sank onto the well's stone rim, her shoulders slumping. But Rhea did not cry. Her ash-gray eyes, which had been so soft after the rain, hardened. They turned to flint. She looked at the salt, at May's despair, at Cassian's clenched fists. She walked to the porch and returned with 2 clean pails and a stack of muslin cloths. "It's a deep well," she said, her voice sharp, practical. "The salt is heavy. It might not have reached the bottom. May, get the kettle. We'll skim. We will filter. We will boil. They will not take this." Her hands were shaking, but her eyes were on fire. The 2 women, one old and frail, one young and furious, began the impossible, back-breaking work of straining the poison from the earth, one bucket at a time. The news of the well and the tax notice hit the town by noon. The invisible lines of allegiance were drawn, sharp and final. Horace Delaney had posted a notice outside the bank. Work, Red Rock line, paying $2 a day. It was a king's ransom for men who lived on credit and promises. When Cassian rode into town to buy sulfur, the blacksmith, a man who had shared his table, suddenly would not meet his eye. "Sorry, Pike, got a rush order, can't help you." The mercantile owner, who had taken Cassian's money for a decade, shook his head. "Just sold my last sack of grain. Seems there was a run on it." The town turned its back. Some did it for the promise of Delaney's jobs. Some did it out of fear. They had seen the poisoned well and the nailed writ. Most did it out of simple, weak self-preservation. Cassian Pike and the widow Calder were on the losing side, and no one wanted to stand with them. That night, Cassian sat at his kitchen table, the false writ spread out under the lamplight. Rhea sat across from him, her hands raw and red from filtering water. "This is Kincaid's signature," Cassian said, tapping the paper. "But it's Cutter's ink. We can't fight them here. The town is bought. The sheriff is bought." "So what do we do?" Rhea asked. "We go over their heads," he said, a new, cold determination in his voice. "We go to the district court. We file an injunction. Where? Red Mesa. It's a 3-day ride. He stood. The decision was made. I'll ride out at dawn. At that same moment, in the telegraph office, Ephraim Cutter was handing a slip of paper to the operator. A message, paid for in cash, clicked its way across the wires, headed straight for Red Mesa. Cutter was already calling in favors, stacking the jury pool, and ensuring that any judge Cassian Pike saw was a judge who understood the importance of the railroad. The net, invisible and strong, was already in place. Rhea's last confrontation came at dusk. She was at the edge of town, by the new, ugly, black scar of Delaney's coal yard, gathering the last of the evening primrose for May's poultices. He did not ride up. He simply materialized from the shadows, a ghost made of dust and gun smoke. Macklin Shore. He lit a cheroot, the match flaring, illuminating his flat, watchful eyes. "Heard you're good at crying, ma'am," he said, his voice soft. Rhea stood slowly, her hands full of yellow flowers. "And I've heard you're good at setting fires and poisoning wells." A flicker of something moved in his eyes. Not anger, maybe surprise. "Delaney, he's a locomotive," Shore said, exhaling a plume of smoke. "He's the future. You and Pike, you're just dust on the tracks. You can't stop an engine by standing in front of it." "We're not stopping it," Rhea said. "We're just not moving." Shore took a step closer, close enough for her to smell the tobacco and the old leather. "You're going to Red Mesa. I heard. You think you're smart. You think you're going to talk. You think you're going to use your words." He leaned in, his voice dropping to a confidential, menacing whisper. "Let me give you some advice. Cry now. Get it all out. Stand right here and weep. Because when you get in that courtroom, in front of those men, you'll cry until you're mute. You'll cry until you choke on it." Rhea did not flinch. She did not back away from the smoke, or from him. She held his gaze. "You're wrong," she said, her voice so quiet he had to lean in to hear it. "Tears are rain." She held his gaze, her own clear and cold as water. "And rain," she finished, "clears the dust." She turned, clutching her flowers, and walked away from him, back toward the ranch. He stood for a long time, watching her go, the red tip of his cheroot glowing in the gathering dark. The camera of the sky pulled back. Rhea, a small, dark figure, walking toward a ranch under siege. Cassian, a distant shape, reinforcing a corral gate. The sky above them was a deep, starless indigo, and far, far to the north, over the jagged line of the mountains, a silent, flickering flash of dry lightning illuminated the clouds. The storm was coming. It was a practicality, born of necessity. Cassian had to prepare the wagon for the 3-day ride to Red Mesa. May's cough, worsened by the damp and the stress, had settled deep in her chest, and she was too frail to be left alone. Rhea's small room behind the bakery was too far, the air too thick with the smells of the town. "The old bunkhouse," Cassian said one morning, not looking at her as he repaired a harness. "It's clean. The stove draws well. It would be easier. For May." Rhea understood. It was not an invitation, but an acknowledgement of the siege. They were pulling in their defenses, forming a tighter perimeter. "I'll move my things." Her things were few: the medical bag, a change of clothes, and the heavy wool shawl he had given her. The bunkhouse was a small, solid cabin of matched logs, set about 30 yards from the main house. It was one room, but the stove was good, as he'd promised, and the bed was solid. It was a fortress of its own. A new routine settled over the Sunglint, the ranch, which had been a place of silent, masculine labor, now had a new rhythm. It was the rhythm of a house under the care of a woman. It was the sound of Rhea's spoon stirring the simmering horehound and mullein in an iron pot on the stove. It was the sharp, clean scent of carbolic soap and boiled linens. Cassian would come in from the corral, the sound of his boots heavy on the porch, and he would stop in the doorway. He'd watch Rhea, bathed in the warm light of the kitchen fire, crushing dried herbs with May's mortar and pestle. May herself, propped up in a chair by the hearth, would be dozing, her breathing easier than it had been in a month. The quiet, domestic sounds, the gentle scrape of the pestle, the tink-tink of the spoon against the pot were a kind of song, a soft, persistent melody of life pushing back against the silence. They were a family forged in the shadow of a threat, a chosen family of 3, bound not by blood, but by a shared patch of contested dirt. "If we're riding to Red Mesa," Cassian said one clear, cold afternoon, "you can't ride that broken-down livery mule. He'll founder before we hit the pass." He led her to the far corral. In it was a single horse, a lean, nervous gray mare with intelligent eyes and a long, powerful stride. "This is Dust Lantern," he said. "She's fast, but she's got a hard mouth. She doesn't trust." Rhea approached, her hand out, the way she had with the injured bay. The mare shied, tossing her head. "She's yours," Cassian said, "if you can ride her." The lesson was not gentle. It was a lesson in will. "Stop fighting her," Cassian instructed, his voice rough. He stood in the center of the pen as she circled. "You're pulling when she pulls. Feel her. Feel the ground through her. She knows what's coming before you do. Trust the horse." He moved to her side, his hand closing over hers on the reins, forcing her grip to soften. "Let her have her head. She's not a mule to be pointed. She's a partner." He put his other hand on the small of her back. A brief, impersonal pressure. "Sit tall. Don't cower. Show her you're not afraid of the speed." Rhea closed her eyes, just for a second, forcing the tension from her shoulders. She breathed in the smell of horse and dust, and she let the reins go slack, just as he said. The mare tested the new freedom. Then her gait smoothed out, the jarring trot settling into a fluid, powerful canter. "Now," Cassian called, stepping back. "Ride." Rhea leaned forward, clicking her tongue. Dust Lantern exploded forward, a streak of gray lightning. The wind hit Rhea's face, a cold, sharp slap that stole her breath. It tore the pins from her hair, whipping it loose. The ground blurred. For the first time in years, she was not running from something. She was running toward it. And a sound tore from her throat, a sound as wild and free as the horse's gallop. She laughed. It was not the small, rusty chuckle from the storm. It was a full, clear, joyous sound that rang out over the corral fence, bright as a struck bell. Cassian stood by the rails, his arms folded. He watched her fly past, her face alive, her dark hair streaming behind her. He felt that laugh land deep in his chest. It was the sound of the woman who swallowed her tears, finally letting something else free. That night, the legal battle began. The kitchen table was their war room. "This tax," Rhea said, her finger on the writ. "It's illegal. There has to be a precedent." "There is," Cassian said. He went to a tall, tin map cylinder in the corner, a thing she had assumed held tools. He pulled off the cap and carefully slid out a brittle, yellowed, rolled document. He spread it on the table. It was not a survey map. It was a drawing, beautifully inked, of the entire valley. The script was archaic, looping, and in Spanish, "A Spanish land grant," he said, his voice quiet with reverence. "From 1795, my great-grandfather bought this land, and the grant, from the original family." Rhea leaned in, her eyes tracing the faded lines. The map was based on landmarks, not precise survey lines. Dos Hermanas for the Twin Buttes, Arroyo Seco for the dry wash. And then she saw it, a thin blue line, snaking its way from the mountains, right through the center of the sun glint. "Cassian," she said, her voice electric. Her finger traced the line. "The well, it's not just a well, it's marked here, Fuente de la Sombra, The spring of the shadow. Cassian leaned over her shoulder, his own calloused finger coming down to trace the line with hers. You're right. He tapped the block of Spanish text beside it. It's designated, con derechos de agua, with water rights. Their fingers met on the ancient parchment, his rough skin against hers, over the faded blue line that represented their entire world. The accidental touch was a jolt, charged with a sudden, brilliant shock of hope. This is it, Cassian said, his voice dropping, his finger not moving from hers. This is older than the railroad. It's older than the territory. It's older than the United States. This is the law Cutter cannot change. The news of their stand had spread, but not in their favor. The town, bought by Delaney's money or silenced by his threats, kept its distance. But the poison of the railroad had spread further, displacing families from the smaller, poorer ranches in the canyons, families who had no deeds at all. They began to appear at the Sunglint, not for help, not for solidarity, but for medicine. One afternoon, a young Mexican woman approached the porch, carrying a child wrapped in a thin blanket. Her boy, maybe 4 years old, was burning with fever. Her 2 other children, small girls in threadbare dresses, hovered in the yard, watching with huge, dark eyes, silent as deer. They were playing a small, quiet game, tracing patterns in the dust with rocks. They were a portrait of life, fragile but persistent, on the edges of the conflict. Rhea took the boy. She brought him onto the porch, bathed his face, and forced a willow bark tincture between his lips. She wrapped him in one of her own blankets. She did not ask for payment. The mother, her eyes full of a gratitude so deep it was painful, simply nodded and whispered, "Gracias, doctora." May Pike watched from the doorway, her small frame wrapped in a quilt. "You're a good woman, Rhea," she said, after the family had gone. "The children are sick," Rhea said, packing her bag. "That's not what I mean," May said. Later, by the fire, May spoke, her voice thin but clear in the quiet room. "Cassian's father, he was a hard man. He built this ranch by breaking his own hands. And the land, it was hard, too. The first winter, we had squatters, men who thought this land was theirs for the taking." Rhea stopped her mending, listening. "They fired on the house, right through that window," May said, nodding at the glass. "I was a girl. I was terrified. I told him, 'Elias, let's go. Let's go back to Missouri. This land isn't worth dying for.'" She looked into the fire, her eyes seeing a different night, long ago. "Elias, he just handed me the shotgun. He kept the rifle. He stood at that window, and I stood at this one. We stayed up all night. They left by dawn." May turned her gaze, sharp and bright, to Rhea. "Love isn't pretty words. Child, not out here. Love is 2 people, standing together, guarding their own door." Rhea's hands were still in her lap. She looked at the old woman, and her eyes, the color of ash, were suddenly shining. The confession, the second one, came later. May was asleep. The house was silent, save for the wind. Cassian was cleaning his rifle by the fire, the Spanish map rolled and secure on the table. Rhea was reading one of her medical texts, but her eyes were not on the page. "She's right," Cassian said, his voice low, startling her. He was staring into the flames, his face hard in the firelight. "My father, he guarded this door. He died guarding it. He was hard. He never looked at the sky. He never saw the good in this place, only the fight." He looked at Rhea. "For 5 years, since he died. I've been the same. This ranch, it was just a rock tied to my neck, a place to defend, a grave. I was just guarding a grave." He set the rifle down. He leaned forward, his hands on his knees. "Since you came, it's not a grave anymore." He looked at her, his gaze raw, vulnerable. "When I heard you laugh on Dust Lantern, it was the first time I realized I'm not just defending this place anymore. I'm I'm building it. It was a confession that cost him more than any story of a past shame. It was a confession of hope. Rhea put her book down. She closed the distance between them, sitting on the hearthrug near his chair. She reached out and, tentatively, laid her hand on his knee. "Cassian," she said, her voice soft. "You're not building it alone." He covered her hand with his large, rough palm enveloping hers, their fingers laced together, a silent, binding agreement. The tension of the world, of Delaney, of the coming trial, pressed in on them. "We leave in 2 days," Cassian said, the anger returning to his voice. "If Delaney tries—" "Shh," Rhea said, squeezing his hand. "No." He looked at her, confused. "Not tonight," she said, her voice firm. "We need to sleep. We're no good to anyone if we're worn down to the bone by worry." She gave him a small, weary smile. "Let's make a rule, a house rule. A rule. From the moment the lamps go out, we don't speak his name. We don't talk about the writ, or the well, or the court. After the lamps are out, this house is ours. The night is ours. We rest." He looked at their joined hands, then at her face. He saw the practicality of it, the wisdom. It was a physician's prescription for a mortal wound. "A good rule," he said, his voice thick. He stood, pulling her to her feet. The moment was charged, suspended. They were not lovers, not yet, but they were more than friends. They were partners. He walked her to the door, the cold night air rushing in. "Rhea," he said. He fumbled in his pocket, then pulled out a heavy, dark, iron key. "The main barn. I fixed the lock after the fire." He pressed it into her hand. "I don't need—" she began. "I know," he said, his voice rough. "I need you to have it. May's right. You stand at the door. You guard this place. With me." She curled her fingers around the key. The metal was cold, but it was solid. It was the weight of his trust. It was the deed to his world. "This ranch," he said, his voice so low she barely heard it. "It's only strong if we share the keys." She met his gaze. She didn't need to speak. She nodded. "Good night, Cassian." "Good night, Rhea." She walked across the dark, moonlit yard to the bunkhouse, the key clutched tight, a solid, comforting weight in her hand. The attack came on the night before they were to leave for Red Mesa. It was past midnight, and a dead, breathless silence had fallen over the territory. The rule of not speaking Delaney's name had been observed. The house was dark. May sleeping in her room, Rhea in the bunkhouse, Cassian on a cot in the kitchen, his rifle beside him. He woke to the smell. It was not wood smoke. It was the sharp, acidic stench of kerosene. He was out the door in an instant, his boots unlaced. The night was not dark. It was lit by a terrible, hungry, orange light. Macklin's crew had not bothered with the barn this time. They had gone for the one thing he could not replace, the last good pasture. The high, dry grass, cured by the long drought, was burning. A 50-yard line of fire was moving fast toward the main barn, pushed by a sudden, capricious breeze. Rhea May fire, his roar was raw. He ran to the barn, not for water, but for shovels and the heavy burlap sacks. By the time he was out, Rhea was running from the bunkhouse, pulling on her boots, her hair flying. May was on the porch, a lantern in her shaking hand. "They're trying to pen us in." Cassian yelled over the growing roar. "They're burning our escape. We can't put it out. We have to turn it." Rhea knew the term, a backfire. "The well," she shouted. "No time the horse trough, May. Soak every sack we have." While May, coughing but resolute, began the slow, agonizing work of drenching the heavy burlap. Cassian and Rhea ran ahead of the main blaze. They dug. They didn't speak. There was only the sound of their shovels biting into the hard, dry earth, the grunt of their breathing, and the hungry crackle of the approaching inferno. They were creating a firebreak, a long, desperate scar of raw dirt. The heat was a physical blow, scorching their faces and drying their throats. The smoke was a thick, acrid blanket, stinging their eyes, making every breath a battle. "It's jumping!" Cassian yelled. A gust of wind sent a shower of sparks over their meager line. The sacks! May was there, dragging the heavy, dripping sacks, her face a pale mask of terror. Cassian grabbed one. He ran to the far side of their firebreak and, with a flaming branch, he lit the grass inside their line. "Now, Rhea!" They began the brutal, rhythmic work. They let their own fire burn a few feet, then they attacked it, beating it out with the wet sacks. Slap, hiss, slap, hiss. The sound was a desperate drumbeat. They were creating a black, burned-out buffer, a dead zone where the main fire would have nothing to eat. A section of the old corral fence caught, the dry wood exploding like a matchstick. Cassian lunged. Grabbing the burning post to tear it free, he yelled, a sharp, involuntary cry of pain, and dropped it, stumbling back. "Cassian?" He ignored her, grabbing the shovel with his other hand, his face pale and slick with sweat. "Keep working, it's turning." Rhea grabbed his arm. "Your hand. It's nothing. Rhea, we don't have time. We lose you, we lose the ranch. Stop!" Her voice was not a request. It was a physician's command. In the hellish, swirling orange smoke, she pulled him to a halt. She tore a long strip from her own petticoat, her hands moving with blinding speed. She doused it with clean water from the canteen at her hip. Her hands were shaking. The tremor was visible in the firelight, but her eyes, lit by the flames, were perfectly, icily calm. Her touch was firm, professional, as she wrapped the seared palm and fingers, her breath hissing between her teeth. She worked with the precise, rhythmic efficiency of a surgeon, her breathing steady, as if she were counting a patient's pulse. "It will hold," she said. "Now, go." It was in that moment, in that shared, smoky breath, that they heard the hoofbeats. On the ridge just above them, silhouetted against the wall of fire, were 3 riders. Macklin Shore sat his horse, a cheroot glowing in his mouth. He and his men were not riding. They were watching, enjoying the show. "That's a fine blaze. Pike," Macklin's voice drifted down, laced with amusement. "Looks like you're having a warm night." Cassian, his newly bandaged hand held stiffly at his side, stepped clear of the smoke. His rifle was where he had left it, leaning against the trough. Macklin saw the movement. He laughed, getting ambitious. He lazily unholstered his pistol and fired a shot. It wasn't aimed at them. It was a warning. The bullet kicked up dirt, spitting gravel that struck May's skirt. She cried out, stumbling back. That was the mistake. Cassian's face went blank. The heat, the pain, the exhaustion, it all vanished, replaced by a cold, white focus. He moved to the trough, his movements fluid, unhurried. He picked up the rifle. Macklin saw the change. He raised his pistol again, this time leveling it. "Don't be a fool. Pike, you're a rancher. I'm a gunman." "You're right," Cassian said, his voice flat. He brought the rifle to his shoulder. Macklin laughed and pulled the trigger, but Cassian had already moved. The shot went wide. Cassian's reply was not a shot. It was a statement. The rifle cracked. A single, sharp report that was entirely different from Macklin's pistol. Macklin's laugh died in his throat. His wide-brimmed hat, a symbol of his authority, flew from his head, spinning end over end, and landed in the dust 20 feet behind him. There was a stunned, absolute silence. Macklin slowly raised a hand, his fingers touching his hair. It was untouched. He was unharmed. The message was delivered, as clearly as if it had been spoken. "I did not miss. I defend. I do not hunt. Get," Cassian said, his voice deadly quiet. "Off my land." Macklin stared at him, his face unreadable in the firelight. But the fire did not wait for standoffs. A sudden, violent updraft sent a river of embers flowing not toward the house, but toward the main corral. The horses, trapped, began to scream a high, terrified sound that cut through the night. "The horses!" Rhea cried. "Cassian, the horses!" The backfire would hold, but the new threat was the corral. "Go!" Cassian yelled, his rifle still trained on the ridge. "Get them out, take them to the gully." Rhea did not hesitate. She ran to the barn, using the iron key Cassian had given her. She grabbed Dust Lantern's saddle and bridle. Her hands were raw, her lungs burning. She saddled the gray mare in less than a minute, her movements a blur of practiced efficiency. The cinch strap groaned as she pulled it tight. The leather of the saddle creaked as she swung up, her leg moving with a fluid, powerful grace. She rode Dust Lantern bareback into the corral, a shadow against the flames. Self-correction. The outline says Yen Gua Ritrenda, saddle squeaking. I will stick to the saddle. She is decisive and prepared. Rhea rode Dust Lantern into the smoking yard, the mare dancing nervously. She threw open the gate to the main corral, her voice a sharp, commanding cry that cut through the panic. "Ya, get move!" She was magnificent. She rode into the swirling smoke, a physician-turned horsewoman, her dark hair streaming, her face smudged with soot and determination. The saddle leather groaned under her, a rhythmic, powerful sound as she worked. She was a single, focused point of will, driving the terrified herd of nearly 20 horses. She pushed them past the burning fence, through the smoke, her eyes fixed on the dark, saving shadow of the dry gully. It was a display of pure, healthy, unself-conscious strength. It was the sensuality of competence, of a woman perfectly, physically alive in a moment of crisis. Macklin and his men, forgotten on the ridge, watched her. They had come to see a family burn. Instead, they were watching a woman save a herd, a rancher make a mockery of a gunman, and an old woman hold the line. Macklin put his pistol away. He did not retrieve his hat. He simply turned his horse, and the 3 riders melted back into the night. By the time Rhea had the herd settled in the deep, safe arroyo, the backfire had done its work. The main blaze hit the burned-out black scar, and, with a final, angry roar, it died. The 3 of them collapsed by the horse trough as the adrenaline fled, leaving them shaking and sick. The field was gone. A vast, smoking black patch scarred the sunglint, but the barn was standing. The house was safe. The horses were alive. The smoke-choked sky was black. Then, a single, thin, silver line was drawn across it. A meteor. "Look," May whispered, her voice a raw croak. Another streak, and then another. A sparse, silent shower of falling stars. Rhea leaned her head against Cassian's good shoulder, her body trembling. They tried to take it all. Cassian looked at the smoking ruin of his pasture. "It's just grass," he said, his voice rough. "It'll grow back." He looked down at Rhea, at the soot on her cheek, at the fire reflected in her ash-gray eyes. "We're still here, Rhea." He nodded toward the distant, unseen town of Red Mesa. "We still have the court ahead of us." At dawn, the devastation was stark. The black field looked like a fresh grave. But as Cassian, his hand professionally bandaged, stood on the porch, a wagon rolled up. It was Jed Miller, the neighbor who had refused him grain. Miller looked at the field, at Cassian, and his face was tight with shame. He didn't get down. He just tossed a heavy sack of oats into the yard. "Heard the commotion," Miller grunted. "Figured you'd need this for the horses. What they did, Pike. It ain't right." He turned his wagon and left. The tide, slow as it was beginning to turn. Hope was short-lived. An hour later, Sheriff Boaz Kincaid rode in, his badge gleaming, his eyes shifty. "Pike Calder," he blustered. "I've had a dozen complaints disturbing the peace, reckless endangerment, setting fires." Cassian, his temper worn to a raw nub, stepped forward. You oily coward. Macklin Shore. Rhea put her good hand on Cassian's chest. Stopping him, she stepped in front. Sheriff Kincaid. Her voice was cold, clear, and carried. We were defending our property from a midnight arson attack, an attack you were, no doubt, paid to ignore. Kincaid's face flushed. I don't know what you're... I see a burned field. Your field looks like your fire. I'm going to have to fine you. $100. Disturbing the peace. Fine, Rhea said. She did not blink. I demand a formal, written citation, and I will require a copy of the official complaint you received, with the names of the complainants, of course, for our lawyer. Kincaid's jaw went slack. And while you're here, Rhea continued, her voice sharp as steel, you can take our formal statement regarding the arson. We will need a copy of that incident report, the Bienban as well, for the district court. The words lawyer, incident report, district court were like slaps. Kincaid, a man who operated on bluff and intimidation, was lost. This is highly irregular, he stammered. Is it, Sheriff? Rhea asked, stepping toward him. Or is it just the law write the citation, or leave? Kincaid looked at her, at Cassian's cold fury. At the smoking field, he was outgunned, and not with bullets. I'll have to check the procedures. Back in town. He wheeled his horse, kicking up dust, and fled. Rhea let out a breath she hadn't known she was holding. Cassian just stared at her, a slow, stunned admiration dawning on his face. My God, Rhea, he whispered. They were by the well, cleaning the soot from their faces, the water still murky, but slowly clearing. Rhea was washing her hands when she saw it, a flat rock on the well's stone rim, a rock that did not belong. Cassian. He lifted it. Underneath was a folded piece of paper, weighted down by a single, spent cartridge. He unfolded it. The writing was a cramped, nervous scrawl. To Red Mesa, be there on the 13th. Court day, ask for Alden Mott. He is the railroad's chief accountant. He is ready to testify. The 13th, that was tomorrow. Cassian showed her the note. They looked at each other, the soot, the exhaustion, the new, sharp, terrifying blade of hope. He reached out with his good, unbandaged hand. She met it with her own. They clasped hands, their grip tight, a silent promise. In the bucket of slowly clearing water at their feet, their two faces were reflected, side by side, determined, unbroken. They had one night. The wagon was packed. The horses were rested. May was staying with the Millers, the neighbors who had brought the oats. The ranch, scarred and blackened at the edges, was locked tight. The key Rhea carried, and the key Cassian kept, felt heavier than they ever had. The moon was a sickle, thin and sharp, a worn-down silver coin in a sky dark enough to drown in. They sat on the top step of the porch, not touching, just existing in the vast, cold silence of the high desert. The wind had returned, a clean, cold breeze from the north that swept over the plains. It rattled the tin roof of the bunkhouse and whispered through the stalks of the unburned barley. Rhea shivered, pulling the heavy wool shawl he had given her tighter. It still smelled faintly of him, of wood smoke and leather. It will be a cold ride, Cassian said, his voice quiet. He was not looking at her. He was looking at the black, ruined patch of his pasture, a scar on the land under the pale starlight. We have blankets, she said. Still, he stood, his movement stiff. He had been checking the wagon's axle, and his muscles were tight. He went back into the dark house. He returned a moment later holding a square of silk. It was dark, a deep navy blue, and folded. My father's, he said. The words offered as a simple fact. He wore it when he rode to Prescott. He said it kept the dust out better than cotton. He stepped in front of her. She looked up, her face pale in the dim light. May I? He asked. She nodded. He unfolded the silk. He moved to stand behind her, but then stopped, awkwardly. He came back to the front and stepped onto the step below her, so they were almost face to face. "Lift your chin," he murmured. She did. He brought the silk up, his large hands surprisingly gentle as he wrapped it around her throat. His bandaged left hand, the one she had wrapped in the fire, was clumsy, the white linen stark in the darkness. He fumbled with the knot, using his good right hand to compensate. "Sorry," he muttered, his fingers brushing the skin under her jaw as he tried to tie the silk. His hand was rough, the calluses like old wood, but the touch was hesitant, light. His fingers paused, resting for a fractional second against the pulse point just below her ear. It was a moment suspended in time, a lifetime of mistakes, of hardness, of fighting the land and other men, all held in that one, still, uncertain touch. He was a man who knew how to break a horse, set a fence post, and fire a rifle with perfect, deadly accuracy. But he did not know how to tie a scarf on this woman without his hands shaking. Rhea did not breathe. She did not pull away. She leaned into the touch, a movement so slight it was barely a movement at all, just a silent closing of the smallest distance. It was all the permission he needed. His hand steadied. He finished the knot, his fingers sliding away, leaving a trail of warmth on her skin. He did not step back. She did not look down. She stood up from the step, so they were standing on the same level. The porch was narrow. His nearness was a solid, undeniable fact. He was a wall of warmth in the cold night. The hug was inevitable. It was not a lunge of passion, but a slow, mutual lean, a gravitational pull of two solitary objects finally finding their orbit. He moved first, his arms coming around her, pulling her close. His good hand settled on the small of her back, the bandaged one resting awkwardly between her shoulder blades. It was not a gentle embrace. It was an anchoring. He held her as if she were the only solid thing in a world that was trying to burn down around them. Rhea slid her arms around his waist, her hands splayed flat against the hard muscle of his back. She pressed her face against his chest, against the rough wool of his shirt. He was solid. He was real. She breathed in the scent of him, the smoke and soap and the clean, sharp smell of the cold night air. They stood like that for a long time, not speaking. Their breathing, which had been tight and shallow, began to deepen. He felt the nervous tremor in her shoulders finally, slowly, begin to ease. She felt the iron tension in his back soften. Their heartbeats, which had been hammering with the adrenaline of the coming day, found a new, slower, steadier rhythm, falling into sync. 2 breaths, 2 heartbeats, 1 small space on a dark porch. She leaned her head back, but did not move out of his embrace. She looked up at his face, shadowed in the moonlight. Her right hand, the one that was not raw from the fire, came up. She did not touch his lips. She did not touch his cheek. She laid her fingers gently on the thin, silvered line of his scar. His body went rigid. It was an involuntary reaction, a flinch from a lifetime of defending that old wound. Her fingers did not retreat. They just rested there, a soft, warm, accepting touch. She traced the scar, from his jawline up toward his ear, a gesture not of pity, but of acknowledgement. She was touching the part of him that was marked, the part that was damaged. And Cassian Pike did something he had not done in the presence of another living soul in 20 years. He closed his eyes. The tension did not just leave him. It fell away. His shoulders, which were always braced for a blow, slumped. The hard line of his jaw softened. He let out a long, slow breath, a sound of absolute surrender. He was letting his guard down. In her hands, he was unarmed. He was safe. She kept her hand there, her thumb stroking the rough skin of his jaw, until she felt the last of the fight leave him. He opened his eyes. His gaze was raw, stripped of all its defenses. He leaned down. The first kiss, in the rain, had been a shock, a recognition. This second kiss was a vow. It was deeper, slower, and full of a desperate, quiet strength. His lips were not soft, they were chapped and firm, but they were warm. He kissed her not with hunger, but with a powerful, focused intensity. He was not trying to take anything from her. He was trying to pour his own resolve into her. "We will not break. I will not let you fall. We will stand." She rose on her toes, her hands clinging to him. She kissed him back with the same fierce resolve. Her mouth was soft, but her response was strong. She was meeting his strength with her own. "I will stand with you. I am not afraid." It was a kiss that sealed the promise, a kiss to hold off the darkness, a kiss to fuel them for the battle ahead. He pulled back, but only an inch. Their foreheads met, resting against each other. They were both breathing hard, their breath mingling in a white cloud in the cold air. A small, weary smile touched her lips. He felt it more than he saw it. "Tired," she whispered. He managed a small, tired smile of his own. "Tame," he answered. It was a joke from the horse pen, but she understood. "We should sleep," he said, his voice thick. "Where?" "The kitchen, by the fire. It's warmer." The house was dark. May was gone. The kitchen was their fortress. The fire in the hearth was banked, a bed of deep, glowing red coals that pulsed with heat. They did not light the lamps. They were too wired to sleep, too full of the coming day. They sat on the thick bearskin rug by the hearth, their backs against the warm stone chimney. He stretched his legs out. She sat beside him, her shoulder pressing against his, her knees drawn up. His good hand found hers in the shadows. He did not just take it. He laced his fingers through hers. A firm, interlocking grip, hand in hand. They sat in the dark, watching the coals. "The rule," he said, remembering their agreement. "No talking about him." "This is not worry," she whispered, her voice a low, intimate murmur in the dark. "This is strategy." He turned his head, looking at her profile in the red glow of the fire. "Alden Mott," she said, her thumb tracing a small circle on the back of his hand. "The accountant. If he is ready to testify, he is afraid. Delaney must have threatened him, or his family. He has to be protected." "I'll see to it," Cassian said. "And when he testifies," she continued, her voice gaining a hard, clear edge, "he has to talk about the ledgers, the infrastructure levy that Cutter mentioned. It will not be in the main books. It will be a separate, hidden account. Ask him for the contingency fund. Ask him where the payments to Boaz Kincaid are recorded." He listened, his grip on her hand tightening. He was listening to her mind, and it was as strong and as beautiful as her courage. "The Spanish grant," he whispered back. "The map." "We save it," she said, her voice sharp with sudden, brilliant tactic. "We let them build their case. We let Cutter and Delaney lie to the court. We let them swear under oath that your water rights are forfeit. We let them put the noose around their own necks. And then we show the map. We trap them in their own perjury." He nodded, a slow, grim smile touching his lips in the dark. "We trap them." They sat in silence, their plans laid, their hands linked. The exhaustion finally began to claim them, a heavy, welcome weight. "Sleep," he murmured. "You too." They did not move. It was too cold to go to separate rooms, and too impossible. They would not be separated. Not tonight. They simply lay down on the rug, their backs to the warm stone, their faces to the dying fire. He pulled a thick wool blanket from his now empty cot and draped it over both of them. He lay on his back, she on her side, her head pillowed on his good shoulder. Their fingers remained tightly interlaced, a solid, unbroken connection between them, resting on his chest. The lamps were out. The house was dark. The rule was in effect. Outside, the north wind, cold and clean, swept across the porch. It found the small, tin wind chime May had hung there years ago. It stirred, and a few, faint, clear notes rang out, a tiny, metallic song in the vast, sleeping, and dangerous dark. Cassian stared into the dim, red glow of the coals, feeling the light, steady weight of her head on his shoulder, the solid lock of her fingers in his. He listened to her breathing as it finally deepened into sleep. He listened to the wind chimes, and he waited. Ephraim Cutter's gavel was frozen in his hand. He looked at the Spanish map, a document that nullified his entire authority. He looked at Macklin's shore, a hostile witness who had just confessed to arson. He looked at the jury, his paid-off men who were now staring at him, their expressions a mixture of fear and open contempt. He looked at Dinah Lawton, who was waiting, her hands politely clasped. And he looked at the back of the room, at the quiet, unsmiling man in the city suit who had entered with Dinah and had not said a word. The man was watching him. Cutter's composure, the slick, oily superiority, cracked. He was a trapped animal. This is a circus," he stammered, his voice rising to a reedy squeak. "The witness is dismissed, this proceeding." "Your Honor." Dinah's voice was sharp as ice. "The jury is impaneled. They have heard the testimony. They are required, by law, to deliberate. Unless you intend to dismiss this jury and declare a mistrial, in which case, my colleague from the U.S. Marshal's office will have a few questions for you regarding federal tampering." The man in the suit stood up. Cutter stared at him, his face ashen. He looked at the jury. "You will deliberate," he choked out. The foreman, a surveyor on Delaney's payroll, couldn't get out of the box fast enough. The 12 men scrambled for the deliberation room, not to debate, but to abandon a sinking ship. The courtroom waited. The heat was immense. The air was thick with the smell of sweat and fear. Cassian's hand, his good one, found Ria's. He gripped it, hard. It was less than 5 minutes. The door opened. The 12 men filed back in, their faces pale. They would not look at Delaney. They would not look at Cutter. "Have you reached a verdict?" Cutter whispered, his bravado gone. The foreman stood. He was shaking. He read from a slip of paper. "On the matter of the writ of seizure against the Sunglint Ranch, we find the writ to be invalid, fraudulent, and without legal merit." A single, collective gasp went through the room. "On the matter of Horace Delaney," the foreman continued, his voice gaining a slight, terrified strength as he cut the cord, "we find him guilty of bribery of a public official. On the matter of Sheriff Boaz Kincaid," by the wall, went rigid, "we find him guilty of malfeasance in office and conspiracy." The verdict landed. It was not a cheer. It was a physical blow, a dry, crackling thunderclap in the suffocating room. It was the sound of a power structure, a reign of terror, breaking apart in a single, devastating moment. Before Cutter could even react, the quiet man in the city suit was walking. He walked past the bar, past Dinah, and stepped directly onto the judge's platform. Cutter leaped to his feet. "Bailiff, remove this man. This is my—" The man produced a pair of handcuffs. "Ephraim Cutter," he said, his voice calm and carrying. "You are under arrest by the authority of the United States government. A federal warrant from Prescott for conspiracy, bribery, and mail fraud." The click of the steel cuffs locking around Cutter's wrists was the loudest sound in the history of Red Mesa. The room, the entire town, held its breath. Horace Delaney, his face a mask of purple, apoplectic rage, was not a fighter. He was a bully. He looked at the marshal. He looked at his paid-off jury. And he ran. He scrambled from his bench, pushing aside a spectator, heading for the side door, for his horse, for his escape. Kincaid, trapped by the wall, was fumbling, his hands half raised in surrender, his face a mottled gray. Macklin Shore had not moved from the witness stand. He watched it all. He watched the U.S. Marshal, calm and efficient. He watched the panicked, pathetic scramble of his employer, Delaney. He watched Kincaid, the man with the badge, stammering and defeated. Then his gaze moved. It found Rhea. She was standing. She had not moved. Her back was straight. Her hands were clenched at her sides. She was not looking at Cutter, or Delaney, or him. She was looking straight ahead. And in the absolute, stunned silence of the room, her composure finally broke. A single tear, born of weeks of terror, of rage, of sleepless nights, welled and fell. It traced a clean, pale line through the faint smudge of soot that still clung to her cheek from the fire. No one laughed. The men from the saloon, the ones who had whistled, were staring at the floor, their faces white. The men who had called her cry doctor were frozen, their silence a new, terrible kind of shame. The title she had been given, the brand of her tears, had just been redeemed. The verdict had, at last, brought silence. Macklin Shore watched that single tear. He saw the strength in the woman who shed it. He saw the pathetic weakness in the men he had followed. He had, as he had told her, stood on the tracks to stop an engine. He had just realized, too late, that he was standing on the wrong side. Slowly, his movements deliberate, he unbuckled his gun belt, the heavy leather, full of .44 caliber cartridges, hit the wooden floor of the witness box with a heavy, final thud. It was a sound of surrender. He unholstered his long-barreled pistol, the tool of his trade, and laid it, gently, on the railing. He looked at Rhea. "I picked," he said, his voice rough. "The wrong side." The silence that followed was thicker than blood, heavier than stone. Cassian did not cheer. He did not pump his fist. The victory was too profound, too costly, to be celebrated with a yell. He let out a breath he felt he had been holding since his father died, a long, shuddering sigh that emptied his lungs. He slowly, almost reverently, removed his hat. He turned to Rhea. She was still standing, her eyes now closed, the single tear track drying on her face. He did not grab her. He did not embrace her. With his good, unbandaged hand, he reached up. He did not wipe the tear. He simply laid his thumb, gently, on her temple, his fingers brushing her hair. It was a gesture of profound, unspoken respect. It was an act of possession. It was a caress of pure, unadulterated love. She leaned into the touch, her body trembling, and he held her steady, his hand on her head, anchoring her to the new world they had just won. Outside, the brutal sun was the same, the dust was the same, but the town was broken. The crowd spilled out of the courthouse, not in a rush, but in a slow, dazed, quiet dispersal. They moved away quickly, avoiding each other's eyes, as if fleeing the scene of a death. A few stayed. Jed Miller, their neighbor, was one. He twisted his hat in his hands, his face a picture of pained, honest shame. "Pike, ma'am," he stammered, unable to meet their eyes. What I let happen. I didn't stop it. I was a coward. I am sorry." Rhea looked at him. Her gaze was not hard. It was not soft. It was just clear. She nodded. Once, she did not offer him forgiveness. That was not hers to give. She did not hold his blame. That was not hers to carry. It was just a nod, an acknowledgement. They all had to live in this valley tomorrow. Dinah Lawton joined them, snapping her leather satchel shut with a sound of sharp finality. "The marshal has Cutter, Kincaid, and Delaney," she said. "They'll be on the stage to Prescott by sundown. The judge there. He's not for sale." She handed the rolled Spanish map back to Cassian. He took it, his hands, one bandaged, one calloused. Closing over the brittle parchment, "The title is clear," Dinah said. "But Delaney was right about one thing. He's poisoned this valley. Not just your well. The trust is broken. The smaller ranchers, the ones he was squeezing, they're still terrified. They still have no water." Cassian looked at the map, then at Rhea. "You should use this," Dinah said, tapping the grant. "It's an anchor, a legal precedent. Use it to form a community trust, a water fund. Guarantee water rights for all the smallholders, based on the original law, not the railroads." Rhea was watching the wind. It was picking up, blowing small dust devils across the plaza. She looked at the blackened, burned-out field of her memory. She looked at the bright, hopeful light in Dinah's eyes. "The Ash Lantern Fund," Rhea said, her voice quiet but firm. Cassian looked at her, a question in his eyes. "From the fire," she said, meeting his gaze. "From the ashes, we held a lantern." Before he could answer, a rattling, familiar sound made them turn. May Pike was pulling the farm wagon up to the courthouse steps. She had, somehow, known, or maybe she just had faith. In the back of the wagon was a massive, steaming blue enamel coffee pot and a tall stack of tin cups. She climbed down, her small frame rigid with a pride that outshone the sun. She did not rush to them. She set up her cups. She poured one, black and hot, and handed it to Dinah. "Counselor, you look dry." She poured one for Cassian, one for Rhea. Then she turned, the steaming pot in her hand, and faced the remnant of the town, the shuffling, ashamed neighbors, the pale-faced men who had, only yesterday, worked for Delaney, the men who had laughed at Rhea. "Well," May Pike said, her voice ringing in the sudden quiet, "the coffee is hot. No sense in letting good things go to waste. Come and drink. The day's not over." It was her revenge. It was not a locked door, not a word of blame. Her revenge was an open kitchen. Her revenge was to force them to accept her grace. A few men shuffled forward, their eyes down, reaching for a cup. And as the first man took a drink, a great, sudden, powerful gust of wind, the kind that comes before a real, cleansing storm, swept across the plaza. It hit the courthouse steps, scouring them clean. It sent a year's worth of red dust, old notices, and dead, dried leaves swirling up into the air, a chaotic, celebratory cloud, and blew it away from them, out over the town. When it passed, the air was still. The heat had broken. The sky, hard and white all day, seemed, for the first time, a full shade brighter. A week later, the town of Ashwater Crossing began to breathe again. The first visible change was at the public well. The old, cracked trough was replaced. A new, sturdy board, its letters burned deep and black into the raw pine, was erected. It read, "This water is community property," and below that, "By authority of the Ash Lantern Fund." The first two names on the contributors list, the founding donation, were Rhea Calder and Cassian Pike. Macklin Shore was gone. He was seen riding east on a tired mule at sunrise the day after the trial. His hat pulled low. He left his gear piled by the blacksmith's. But his saddle, a fine, hand-tooled piece of leatherwork worth at least $100, was found on the porch of the Sunglint bunkhouse. There was no note. It was the only way he knew to pay his debt. A confession and an apology in leather and silver. Rhea looked at it for a long time. It was the tool of a violent trade. She had Cassian sell it to a trader passing through from Prescott. With the money, she had Dinah Lawton establish a small trust, sending every dollar to a children's orphanage in a different county, a place far from the railroad's shadow, where the money could build something that was clean. Horace Delaney was led onto the afternoon stage in handcuffs. He no longer looked like a locomotive. He looked like a small, soft man in a wrinkled suit. The grand house he was building on the hill above the town, the one meant to survey his new empire, was left to the wind. Within 2 months, The weeds grew high, reclaiming the wood, and the desert began the slow, patient work of erasure. At the Sunglint, the work of rebuilding began. The air smelled of freshly cut pine. The black, scarred pasture was still a wound on the land, but the hay shed had to be rebuilt before the first snow. Cassian, his burned hand now healing to a pink, new scar, set the main posts. He worked with a steady, powerful rhythm, his muscles moving with the confidence of a man rebuilding his own world. Rhea was at his side. She was not a helper. She was a builder. She measured and sawed the planks, her movements sure, her hands now as familiar with the grain of wood as they were with the human body. They finished the frame as the sun began to bleed into the western mesas, painting the sky in shades of deep orange and purple. They stood side by side, covered in sawdust and the clean sweat of good labor, looking at the solid, perfect lines of the new structure. Cassian turned to her. He did not speak. He just opened his arms. Rhea stepped into them. It was not the desperate, anchoring hug of the dark night, nor the hesitant, rain-soaked embrace. This was the embrace of partners, of survivors. It was solid, complete. His arms locked around her back, pulling her tight against his chest. Her own arms wound around his waist, her hands gripping his shirt, her cheek pressing against the solid wall of his shoulder. They stood like that for a long time, listening to the wind sing through the new, raw wood. Two people who had been through the fire and had come out the other side, holding on. That night, the house was quiet. May was asleep. The fire in the hearth had burned down to a deep, pulsing bed of red-gold coals. They sat on the thick rug, sharing a blanket, the silence comfortable between them. Rhea was leaning against his side, her head resting on his shoulder. She lifted her hand, the one that had been wrapped in the fire, and laid it flat on his chest, over his heart. She had done it before, by the rain-swept porch, to feel if his heart was still beating. Now, she did it just to feel the rhythm of it. Thump, thump. It was slow, and steady, and sure. The beat of the ranch, the beat of the man. He looked down at her, his face soft in the red glow of the coals. He covered her hand with his own, pressing her palm flat. A shared, silent acknowledgement. He leaned down. He did not kiss her mouth. His lips, chapped from the sun, brushed her forehead. A kiss of respect. He kissed her right eyelid. A feather-light touch. A kiss of peace. He kissed her left eyelid. A promise of safety. His lips traced the high line of her cheekbone, a whisper of warmth, until they hovered just over hers. "We are home, Rhea," he whispered. The words a vibration she felt more than heard. He kissed her. It was a kiss of profound stillness. It was not the desperate kiss of the night before the trial, nor the startled kiss of the storm. It was a kiss of arrival. It was slow, and deep, and certain. It was not a kiss of passion, but of absolute belonging. It was the kiss of a man who was no longer just guarding a grave, but was building a life. Later, they lay in the dark, listening to the sound of the crickets, a sure sign that the land was alive. Rhea's voice was a murmur, a thought spoken aloud. "That day, in the saloon, they laughed at me. They laughed at my tears." Cassian was silent for a long moment, the only sound her breathing and the distant wind. He shifted, pulling the wool blanket higher, tucking it around her shoulder. His voice, when he spoke, was a low, final rumble in the dark. "They laughed," he said. "They did." He paused, his arm tightening around her. "Today, they learned silence." Dawn came cold and sharp. The sky was a pale, clear, ringing blue. A single, sharp whinny cut the morning air. Dust Lantern, impatient, was calling from the corral. An hour later, 2 riders left the Sunglint. Rhea was in the lead. She wore the dark blue silk scarf at her throat, and her medical bag was tied securely behind her saddle. Dust Lantern, sensing her rider's purpose, moved in a fast, ground-eating trot. Rhea was the physician. She was riding out to the small, outlying farms, the ones that were now part of the Ash Lantern Fund, the ones that needed her. Cassian rode a few paces behind and to her right. He was not leading her. He was not protecting her. He was with her. His rifle was in its scabbard, his gaze on the far, open horizon. The old, narrow, rutted wagon trail that led away from the ranch opened up before them, widening as it met the high, empty, sunlit plains of the new territory. This was the West, a land that had always understood the loud, hard, simple law of the gun. But in this one valley, a new precedent had been set. Justice was not found in the speed of a draw. It was found in the rustle of an old Spanish map. It was found in the quiet, damning numbers of an accountant's ledger. It was found in the courage of a woman who refused to be broken. And love, here, was not a soft thing. It was a practical thing. It was a hand that reached for a shovel. It was a shoulder to lean on in the dark. It was the simple, profound, unbreakable promise of a hand that refused to let go. Thank you for listening to this story. If it warmed your heart like a hearth on a windy night, let us know where in the world you're listening from. Drop a comment below. Share your thoughts, and let's build this community. Please subscribe to Wild West Stories 1850. Give this video a like, and support us by hitting that hype button so this story can be heard by more folks just like you.